Good morning and welcome to this webinar entitled Agile Minds Think Bigger, Data Management Culture, on the subject today of data governance. We're running a whole series of webinars and roundtables on the topic of data management culture, and this is the second installment of that whole series. We've already run one, which is really around data strategy and collaboration. Today we're talking about the role of data governance and how it's helping organizations move into the new world where we have to seriously consider how organizations transform, survive and thrive in the new economies. My name is Andy Joss. I'm head of data governance for Informatica, and I'm joined by Mel this morning. Mel?
Hi, I'm Melanie Parker, and I'm a principal consultant working with Agile Solutions, and I head up the data governance community there.
Thank you very much. So let's get cracked on. So as we said, this is the second installment in the series, and I'm just going to pick up a couple of slides from the previous, really to just set a bit of a scene for us. I think one of the things that we've noticed that in the world of organizations going through digital transformation, there's probably some key things that we're seeing a lot of the leading organizations looking at and actively getting engaged in. And that's moving from a way that many businesses think about the role of data, where the process for the organization, the processes of the organization drives the data. But in reality, many organizations are trying to understand how do we move from that paradigm to the new one where data drives the process. Digital transformation for many organizations needs to be and should be data driven. So therefore, having data at the heart of the business, data driving the process, seems to make an obvious sense set of activities that would drive organizations down particular paths and particular routes. But actually, like any asset, data doesn't look after itself. And data magically, it doesn't do what people want it to do without data maintenance and without data care. And the topic of data governance today is really talking about how we can start to instill some of those disciplines, those principles, those ideas and practices into organizations to help them unlock the value of their data and help drive their digital transformation forward and help realize the value of a data management culture. I think one of the things that we just wanted to put into a little bit of context compared to the first webinar and first roundtable is this idea of collaboration, and moving from data governance to data collaboration at an organizational viewpoint actually requires organizations to think about what we're calling a data governance maturity shift. And that's partly been driven by the use of technology and the requirements in the business for data, but it's very often felt from organizations through the end users, people, users, consumers of data, and the constraints that they have and the challenges they have around managing and making decisions on data. And of course, all the way through to people who are at the very sharp end of a lot of the customer experience and new engagement models that organizations have got around data science. So in terms of communities of people, clearly we're seeing a number, but this maturity shift is happening right now. And it's materially happening because organizations need to unlock the value of data to help drive their digital transformation. But actually just thinking about this in a broader context, and this idea of data management collaboration, of which data governance is a key part, in a context viewpoint, we still need to think about business outcomes. What is it we're trying to achieve as a business? We've also got to think about innovation and about how we innovate and what innovation means, but actually do that in a world where everything's changing potentially, and also thinking about how we manage performance and insight. The data supply chain is clearly one of the key things that we need to be thinking about, and we'll be talking a little bit more about that in a later webinar. And today we're going to focus on data governance and some of the data management practices we think are key to helping organizations unlock the value of that data. Previous webinar, we talked a bit about roles and responsibilities, but that's probably something we'll come back to a little bit later on in the next webinar. So this idea of transform, survive and thrive, it's resonating very well in the marketplace we're finding, but actually one of the things that we found is useful is really to get an understanding from organizations of kind of where they are in terms of their thinking and their execution around this. So this morning we've got a poll, and what we'd ask you to do is to go onto the tool, and actually we've got a question for you this morning. And the question is really about how mature is your ability to drive positive business outcomes from your data governance program. We've given you 4 options. Everything from low maturity and just starting all the way through to been there, done that and gotten the t-shirts, which I think is a fantastic way of thinking of it. But the point being is we're trying to get a sense is, well, where are people at in all of this? How successful are they being? And how quickly are organizations on the uptake around the governance of data and particularly driving outcome from it? And already I can see that we're starting to get some results coming back in. And actually right now, I think the bulk of people are probably sitting in the second area, started but struggling to demonstrate value, some sitting on the low maturity and just starting. And actually a few we're now just starting to see in the well engaged but more to do. Interestingly enough, and probably some of you also see, Mel, that actually I've not seen anybody yet saying I'm in the been there, done that and gotten the t-shirt category.
Yeah.
You seen the same thing?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, so for those of you that voted, thanks very much. Let's just close that poll. So just let me quickly share the results for you so you can just get a sense as to where people were at. So it's great to see that some people are well engaged, but obviously there's more to do. It's a journey, so we get that. Actually started but struggling. Okay, getting started is also very good.
Yeah.
But actually just starting, yeah, there's potentially plenty more work that we could be doing there. So all told, I think that's a really useful way of setting a scene in terms of what organizations are trying to do and how they're trying to approach data governance. Okay, so let's carry on with the rest of the story. So if we then pick up data governance as a topic in its own right and think about its role in terms of this idea of organizations transforming, making sure they're in that survival mode, and in particular how they're going to thrive in the new economy and in the new world, there's probably a key set of capabilities that we need to think and have in place. And we went through this actually on the last webinar, but I'm just going to build this out quickly for you now in terms of some of the things that we think are really important in how organizations put together their thinking, their strategy and execution around data to help drive that data management culture. First webinar, we focused on the 4 left-hand boxes of data strategy, roles and responsibilities, collaboration, and business connection to data. Today, we're going to focus on the data governance aspects, which are the ones in the ready color in the second column from the left. So let's put some context and go a little bit deeper into that. So actually, one of the reasons this becomes really important, of course, is because every day lots of decisions are made actually without enough understanding and context of the data that the decisions are being made from. And that's partly due to the fact that people assume a lot about data. Instinctively, we do that as just human beings. And of course, we know what assumption makes. And clearly, we're too polite on this webinar to go and call that one out. But everybody, I think, knows what that means. But actually, more importantly, is just think about the impact of the assumptions that we're making. Well, we're probably missing opportunities. I think that's probably fair to say. We're probably having errors in judgment and action. Maybe some mistakes are coming through. Some overconfidence in understanding of what's going on in our business, and just generating misunderstanding across the organization. Is the picture correct? Are we doing the things? And in some cases, it's all of these. And the challenge we've got, of course, is to make sure that in terms of how we move from this world of assumption to, well, let's get some more facts and understanding of what's actually happening. Let's try and see if we can address that. And that's where data governance starts to play a role. And this idea of, let's stop assuming and let's start getting some clarity and understanding. It's a really important tenet of what data governance gives us. But actually, I think we need to kind of dip a little bit deeper into, well, okay, so let's think more about how data governance starts to fit in what it feels like. So Mel, can you just walk us through that?
Sure, that's really interesting, Andy. Thank you for that. So from my perspective, just having a bit of a look at the poll there, with the majority of you struggling to demonstrate some value, I think it really comes back to how we are actually using the data, what types of data, what is the actual purpose of that data. Now, we can talk about operational type data, which is what you use in a day-to-day business for the functionality of the kind of companies and business that you operate, but also dealing with other types of data, such as personal data. So for those of you that have gone through your regulation journey around GDPR, that type of thing, we're looking at how we handle sensitive types of data and different types of pockets and buckets of that data. But what's quite interesting is how we actually move on to thinking about how we actually getting that value that you talked about before, Andy, and how that attributes back to the data strategy and the big picture outcome. So, we talk about digital transformation, but what's that got to really do with data governance? How do we then start thinking about how we make sure that we're ready for things like automation? Where does compliance drive the data between those kinds of platforms and the wider holistic view? But also, what's the actual strategy of how we're using that strategic asset? How do we make sure that we strike that balance between doing what we want with the data, but also thinking about the security of that data, the compliance, and more importantly, how we avoid the big pitfalls of risk around using that data at the first time.
And I guess just to pick up on one of the points we talked about earlier, if we are going to have data-driving process, which we were talking about earlier, then clearly we've got to have the right amount of control, but also the right amount of flexibility and agility built into this model.
Exactly.
Yeah, okay, that makes sense.
Okay, so for those of you that have went through previous webinars with ourselves, we did have one specifically on GDPR about a year or so ago now, and we talked about how those privacy challenges are very much today the same challenge as they were 2-3 years ago. However, the technology and the data processes are helping us to really see a way through that now. So a lot of it is, where is our data? Can we find it? What security actually applies to it? If we need to do subject access requests or data protection impact assessments, well, how do we know what's in scope? What boundary do we apply to that? Do we actually know what the rights of those individuals are? Now that the context and the business language has moved on, do we really embed that into the process of every day? Consent management is probably still a big thing now, especially for retail, etc. So how do we actually make sure that that's being audited and there's data lineage and governance now embedded as a view that's more than just a web app or a web form? And clearly then security. So how does the security model fit all around that, and do we have to now think differently about security architectures and that type of thing?
And I guess, thinking about data privacy, then clearly data privacy is about individuals.
Yep.
But I guess a lot of organizations, when they think about privacy, will be thinking about employees and customers. But actually, from a business viewpoint, customer experience is important, so we're thinking about customers. So there's a natural link, I think, between the word of privacy and digital transformation, because it's about people. And clearly, digital transformation for most organizations is about that kind of customer experience in the new business model, which is going to be around your customers. But also then, I guess, the practices and management of data that goes with data privacy, just good management practices that would help digital transformation.
Exactly. Yeah, that's fair. And I always have seen that data governance is actually good business governance. So it's kind of underpinning what you have to do with that customer experience.
Yeah. Okay, cool. Thank you.
So we delve into data types and definitions, and without bamboozling people there with science, this is more to talk, when I talked about before around those buckets of data and the types of data we're talking about, whether it be operational, analytical, personal data, that type of thing. Because I don't think a lot of people truly understand the structure and the makeup of what data is. Yep. People assume data's data, right? It's the same thing that we use all the time. But I want to just explore a little bit about the different types of data that we're talking about. So just to give you a bit of a sort of cheek on what we're trying to define as a glossary of terms, is the analogy of two pieces of fruit, right? It's an apple, it's a pear. They're both green, they're both edible, they both grow in trees, but they're not actually the same. So the same absolutely applies to data, which is to say, well, even though the construct of that data is the same, do not assume it's the same thing. And I think when we talk about data quality, data cleansing, and those types of activities, there is a lot of assumption that goes on around, well, it is the same, so therefore it should be used in the same context.
So coming back to the point, let's stop assuming.
Yeah, exactly. So from Agile Solutions perspective, there are 4 key components of data types. Now that goes from master data, which is the data that's unique for your business that you would master. Your reference data, which is the data that you always call out towards in terms of using that. So that's your location data, your time, date stamp, that kind of thing. Metadata is the data which enriches your data. So this is the data that you would use for flagging your data, making sure you've got a lot more context around those data elements that you should use. And transactional data is the data about the data that is used and is in-flight data. So they use the data of where it went from, where it came from, where it's going, and what it's used for. So again, it's more enriching that kind of picture of what a normal data set would look like.
And in your model, given you've got a pyramid here, is the size of the slice significant of kind of volume of data? Because some people might think of it that way.
Yes, absolutely. It's a really good point that you've raised there, Andy, because transactional data is voluminous. It happens every day, every second, every time the data is there. So it's very voluminous, whereas master data is those core critical elements of your business that you would want to have as a unique core element of your business. So therefore, it's not going to be as voluminous as transactional data, and so therefore it flows through from top to bottom.
Yeah, okay, makes perfect sense.
So if we move on to transactional data, I don't need to read this through from word for word, but essentially what we're trying to make sure is that what is the definition of what we mean here? So this is all your dimensions of your data. It tends to be numerical value, and it refers to one or more objects. And what we mean by that is, as that data is passing from system to system to system, it's going to pick up those key markers, I feel like, around where it's been. So as you can imagine, payroll, invoices, payments, some large ERP systems, and that kind of voluminous data is what we would mean by transactional data in that. So it's the records that are just applied for every time that data moves.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. However, when it comes to data governance, we're talking about what's the root cause analysis of some of the issues that we see here. So clearly, in every component of this, we've got people, process, and technology. Specifically for transactional data, it always comes down to human error, data entry at the same time. The process, well, it tends to be because there's no data standards, but even for those standards that are employed, they're poorly defined and they're not consistent. So the aspects and the overhead of actually trying to do some quality assurance around that is quite difficult. Technology, yep, lack of system controls, but what we really mean by that is integration, interfacing, again, being able to go through that API network. How do we make sure those data policies and standards have been applied? And again, inconsistency. So what we find with transactional data is it does result in a lot of poor data quality management. So that's really what the typical root cause of analysis is for that one.
Okay.
Metadata, well, I've talked a bit about what metadata actually is, but there are two different types of metadata, which is your technical metadata, which is picked up in your systems, and it's the tagging and etc. that you get, and it's very, very useful for when we get to the point about data lineage, because you're going to need that to record the aspects of those historical records. But your business metadata is really more about the definition of how you want to use that data, and it's around about what, also functionally, well, where does it belong? So this is where it picks up aspects of your data ownership and its actual purpose within the organisation, rather than being just a descriptor about the data set itself.
And I guess also it's also going, what does it actually mean in different parts of the business or to different businesses? All
absolutely, absolutely. Even if it has two different connotations to it.
Yeah. All the same connotation, different description.
Exactly. Yeah. So what do we mean by typical root cause analysis for this? So you've still got the people, process, technology aspect, but this is just a clear examples of where we see a lack of skills, or where there's nobody that really understands metadata management per se.
And CIA in this context is not an American agency?
No, but this is just more about the centralisation of that technology around metadata. Do we have... in the context of the full data governance structure, you need people that really understand metadata specifically. For processes, we're talking about that enterprise data model. Now, we're not talking about enterprise data architecture that might take a multitude of years to build up, but we're talking about what's that particular use case or business supply chain or a data model, is that as you're building it through, you should always think about those data dictionary and business glossary terms that fit that actual data model. So this is where you're then aligning data and solution design along with your data governance efforts.
That makes sense.
And then technology, because a lot of systems do have aspects for managing metadata, but as we know, a lot of our data is handled and managed in spreadsheets. And a lot of the technology may be on legacy platforms, so mainframes and that type of thing. So they are not equipped with metadata aspects. So what you'll end up finding is that if you look under the hood with a lot of these things, a lot of the metadata will be either missing or it will be incomplete. And so therefore the full record means that you have to go back and do some remediation work. So what does that mean? It means that if you're tackling this from an IT project perspective, clearly it's going to take longer and cost more because you're having to go back and do a lot of technical depth to assess what metadata needs to apply.
Okay, makes perfect sense.
Now, reference data is a very interesting one for me, because the reference data is all of the data that you can actually use in a democratization perspective. Instead of collating that data and reusing it by business function, which tends to happen from a lot of clients that I see, what we're trying to get to this point is that we build it once and reuse it many times. So this could be, for example, your location codes or currencies or weights and measurements, units of measure, branding, financial cost centers, etc., because this is well known and well understood data, and I don't see why we should have to reinvent it every time that we're doing a new business model, especially within multiple functions of the same business, because it takes longer, it costs more, it develops more, it's structured more, it's just more data that you need to manage, when actually if it's a reference data catalogue that you're referring to at every point, therefore it makes it much easier to consume and then disseminate as and when you need to.
And I guess the idea of something you were talking about earlier, this kind of data supply chain, I guess having this reference data capability sitting at the core of that, so that actually we can probably do more in terms of automating the flow of information and data around an organisation, because it's kind of helping make sure that everything keeps moving because everything lines up.
Absolutely, and just a very quick example on that, Andy, is what I see, especially in global organisations where they tend to have like a timestamp.
Oh yeah.
Oh yeah, so you've got a UK timestamp, and then the US one is sort of back to front, and then so it leads to a lot of data quality issues when the same standard is not adopted. So that's quite an interesting point.
Cool.
However, we know that there's still going to be issues with this, alluding to the fact that we've got multiple silos creating it different ways in different parts of the business. So we've got manual data entry, and this tends to be in spreadsheets, with people think, oh, I need a unique ID, I need to be able to structure this, so I'll do it my way, and it's in a spreadsheet. But there's no business glossary assigned to that, so we can't bring it into the enterprise view. The processes, you've got lots of companies that are doing merger acquisitions, you've got lots of interpretations of that, you've got clearly the localized versus global views, and so the standards start to get a little bit out of sync with each other, and therefore it really then starts to disrupt the processing of that information. And technology goes back, there seems to be the same theme here, but lack of that ability to have default values across the systems, rich metadata that's going to help that, and lack of data migration means everything then goes a bit out of sync. So what you find is, going back to my earlier point about using this from a project perspective, is that you rely then on a lot of manual data mapping, and a lot of everything has to happen for that project rather than thinking about it from an enterprise view.
Okay, and I guess the enterprise view, we clearly, if we're going to do that data-driven digital transformation, we do need to be thinking about how this scales to an enterprise view.
At least show and demonstrate the impact of that.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So last but not least, we talk about master data. Now, not every organisation is going to have a lot of MDM and a lot of master data management to have to concern themselves with, but for those companies out there that are dealing with a lot of financial products, customer data, supplier data, employee data, or indeed citizen data for some of our public sector clients, it's very difficult now to really think, oh, we've got one channel for data. We've got a multitude of instances, multitudes of the same person or the same object or the same entity. So therefore, master data is how do we, never mind the technology of how we do it, it's more about the what. What does constitute a customer? What does constitute a product, employee, supplier, or vendor? So we need to think about what is those core critical elements that we use to deliver that particular business model. But as we see, no single version of the truth. A lot of the issues come down to just creating multiple instances of not just incomplete or inaccurate data, going back to my previous point, but actually then multitudes of copies of that. So you end up with huge volumes of data with different connotations, different disciplines and descriptors, but actually they're all trying to mean the same thing. So how do we bring that together?
Perfect.
Okay. So a lot of it is to do with we look at the people aspect of this. A lot of people have asked me in the past, what constitutes the data governance organisation? Because again, a lot of this isn't to do with technology, it's to do with how do we get the right culture and the concepts and the people and the skills to look at that. So just as a quick part of this, and we will explore this in much more detail at one of our near roundtable sessions, but we would just like to explore with you just a typical model that shows what a top-down data governance approach would look like. So I've split it out in terms of the business organisation versus the IT organisation, because I will start off by saying that previous experience has alluded me to think about data governance having been born from an IT functional area because they've seen the need for it, but it's getting buy-in to the rest of the business. So therefore, this is really just from a global top-down positioning as to where the roles and responsibilities sit across both of those organisations. See that, Andy? So really what we're talking about is what's the difference between a system owner and a steward, what's the difference between a steward and an administrator, And really, how does that feed then right up into your sort of CXO level suite, where you've got the new coin term Chief Data Officer?
Yeah.
And how is that any different to your chief or your CIO or your CTO, where it's much more of a technology focused? So the real key point that I want to take away from this is that data governance should sit in a business organisation, not an IT organisation.
Yeah, great.
But they are two very intrinsically linked.
And I guess that for me has always been one of those key things about governance, and it's the team sport across the business.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, cool, thank you. And I think the idea of the organisation and kind of how you start to put that structure in place, I think gives opportunities for an organisation to say, well, if we're large, small, it doesn't really matter, but and these might be people, there might be roles or teams, doesn't really matter. The point being is having a structure where people know what it is that they're responsible, what they're accountable for.
Well, exactly, and that move to that data-centric world means that it's much more in the hands of the business. These are the people that understand the data they use in everyday coin terms, so therefore to manage the data that they use, to understand the definitions, how they want to set it up, that's why it belongs with more business SMEs than technical ones.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. And I guess one of the things you said there, Mel, was interesting. It's not just about the technology, and I completely agree with you. I do think technology has a role to play, because one of the things that when you kind of think through some of those challenges you've got, you think, well, how do we go about solving those? And I think technology has a role to play in helping solve those things, helping get adoption of some of these kind of capabilities. And if we looked at, just pick some of the examples, you talked earlier about, the ideas of data quality and fixing data quality. Well, actually, data quality is a massive topic for pretty much every organisation in some way, shape, or form.
Yep.
So the idea that we can use intelligent technologies to help address some of these issues, I think is quite an important one. And actually, people get quite worried about data quality because it sounds like it's big and it's complex. Well, it can be big and complex if you want it to be, but actually, if we can apply some intelligent technology, we can make this a much simpler and easier process. And actually, we think of it as actually just a simple three-step process. And the first is actually we need to define, well, what do we mean by data quality? In your example of the timestamp, is it a European date or is it a US date? Simple things like that.
Yeah.
But also we can get quite complex in terms of calculations and all those kind of things, whatever's relevant for a business. I think then once we've done that, then clearly we want to go and look at the data and we want to understand, well, let's measure the quality of the data, because this is when we're now starting to get a view, okay, how good is it or how bad is it in reality? And what does good mean or what does bad mean? And we need to think about those kind of constructs. And also people don't generally speaking know, so can we visualize that? So people can go, right, I start to understand maybe where the problem's coming from or kind of the sources of the issues that I have to deal with. And then, of course, once we've done all of this, we've got the insight, then we still need to think about, okay, so we need to fix it, or remediation is how we would call that. And we can start to think about how we can use technology to maybe automate some of this. In some cases, technology doesn't apply, and we need to give it to people to make some decisions. Okay, whatever's right for an organization. The important point being, I think, if we can have some technology to help manage this process, and audit it, track it, and all those kind of good things, it helps build confidence in the data. And we can start to address some of the issues you talked about earlier. And actually, I like to think of data quality as a really good example of how we can use technology in a different way. Rather than it just being a tool to help understand organizations, understand data and what they need to do, biggest question you had on your slides of going back to root cause, where does the problem of the quality of the data come from?
Yeah.
So actually using tools and the context of data, these are all good governance principles, should help doing that. And the example I've got on the slide here is actually just to say, if I'm looking at some data in a particular report, I can see that one of the quality tests around completeness for a field is red. Okay, let's assume red is bad. That's probably a fairly good assumption. But actually, if we see the context of data related to this report and where it's come from, if we go back, if we go back, then you can see actually in the previous point in a different system of the data warehouse, and actually the completeness was very good. So something's happened between the data warehouse and the report where I've got the problem. And you can see here that I've got a spreadsheet sitting in the middle. And you can see here there's no quality rules attached to it, otherwise we'd be able to see them. So what it's starting to do is to give you some insight into where the problem is as well as what the problem is.
So it's a really interesting point, Andy, because with some of the clients that I'm working with at the moment, they do talk a lot about just applying a one-size-fits-all data cleansing activity. And I think clearly from what you're demonstrating there, and going back to the point about the data types, that you can't just apply that same cleansing rule across the board, because it will mean different things and have different connotations.
Absolutely.
Each use.
Yeah. And so when you think about scaling this, if you're a large complex organization, this report might be a good example. That particular field might be in multiple different systems, it might be called different things, but it's the same thing. So we need to understand if we want to apply a quality rule, if there's lots of places, then we don't want to do that manually. We actually want to automate that process. So if it makes sense to apply the same rule to the same piece of data in different places, then let's do that. But if it's different, we need to think about how we manage and automate that process too.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's a good point that for the key takeaway from me, which is it's not always necessary to update every single system with the same rules or the same data, and I think that's where people get quite stuck with the spreadsheet management because they're trying to make sure that every field looks and feels the same, but actually people will have different rules for each of these, and that comes down to the reference data point as well, which it's very plausible that you'll have different use cases for that.
Absolutely right. Absolutely right.
Thank you.
And actually, one of the things that you were just talking about there when we were talking earlier about things like transactional data, actually one of the big issues that we see for organisations is along those lines of actually the challenges they're having around data. Here's a few stats that we kind of picked up about some of the things that we see a lot. I mean, just the sheer explosion in the amount of data, and then we've got all these new users. We saw a lot coming in through GDPR. Suddenly we've got people very often from a legal background, as the former data privacy officers, materially being involved in the world of the management of data, but not necessarily data professionals. We've got lots of different new devices, they're generating data. We've got all this data that's sitting in the cloud. We've got AI and machine learning and robotics. So there's an awful lot going on in the world of data, which is challenging for organizations. And you talked earlier about the role of metadata. Well, when we've all of that data, then actually we've got an awful lot of metadata we need to think about as well. Yeah. So actually, how do you gather and make sense of all of that? And again, I think it's another area where we can start to apply some technology to make life easier for people in governing their journey, their governance journey. So in terms of what we do, we build into our data platform, intelligent data platforms, the AI machine learning technology, really to kind of accelerate the process. And probably some of the key things it does, sometimes it's maybe simple but very profound things. Big organizations struggle with finding data that's relevant to them. So we can use AI machine learning to automate the tagging of data to make it easier to find things. We can just take away that pain for people. So sometimes it's quite simple, but also very profound things. Sometimes it's actually very, very strategic, important things like alerts. So what happens if I have an anomaly in terms of the way my data is being used? Very important in the world of GDPR. Does my data suddenly appear in a place that it shouldn't? Well, actually, technology can spot that, whereas humans, we probably wouldn't have a chance or would catch it too late. So this technology and AI, I think, helps manage all of that. You talked earlier about metadata. Completely agree. When we think about metadata, actually, we think about metadata to give us what we call data context. So it gives us a technical understanding of the data we've got, which is great, but also we need to understand the business relevance of it. We need to understand the operational practices around, and of course, how it's being used and who's using it. So when we have that view, which we get from metadata, I think we're in a much better position to help organizations get the value out of the data, because now they know a lot more about the data, and we've helped them stop assuming, which is one of the things we talked about earlier. But we've also got to recognize that most organizations have what we call the messy reality, which is, not everything's perfect. Exactly. But hybrid, that's a really good word. I like that. Hybrid organization. Yep. And actually thinking about, there's lots of things that organizations know, which is great. So we need to think about how we capture that. What we call they think they know, and that's typically sits in people's heads, that kind of institutional knowledge that you always worry about walking out the door if people leave. And also what we can discover. So actually one of the key things in terms of the technology revolution in the world of data governance is that we can start to automate, particularly in the discovery of information. We can start to capture things which already exist and reuse them, and rather than being static documents like a static process diagram or a static project plan. They become living documents as part of the world of governance. It helps give people context, and when they get context, they get confidence in the data they're using. So there's this idea of what we call intelligent data governance, and basically it's about enabling us to utilize what we know or what we can discover. But we also need to think about where does the metadata come from, and actually some of it exists, so we can just go and tap into it. So examples that might be project plans and business process models, but also we still need to go and talk to people. So there's still a human element to all of this, and there are things where we can automate technology to go and discover. But the important thing is that we need to bring all of that together. So I think one of the key things you talked about with your pyramid is about all these things and how they come together. And it's about asking some business relevant questions, and that's really why we're doing this. It's not doing it for fun, although it can be fun. It's about how we actually ask and answer questions that the business is really interested in. But actually just integrating that stuff on its own really isn't that enough. So we need to add some intelligence. And again, we have the role of AI and machine learning for all around the metadata And that's really trying to solve some problems, because with all those data problems, we've got huge amounts of metadata, and it's a complex world that organizations live in. And sometimes finding a needle in the haystack is really hard. So we're going to use technology to help us do that. And again, we use AI and machine learning as part of the platform, whether it be at a quality level or a discovery level, to help organizations manage this whole process. I guess one of the other things that you also touched on, I see this a lot, I've got quite a strong opinion on it, about who's involved in the world of intelligent data governance. I hear this a lot. Well, it's an IT project, isn't it?
No.
No. Data governance is absolutely a team sport. It's a collaborative effort between business and IT, and that's why I liked your organizational structure.
Yeah.
You get to see the collaboration come through on that structure.
It's not always just one or the other, but it is interestingly linked. However, yes, it's just showing the demarcation.
Yeah, no, exactly. And actually, one of the things you talked about in the role of the chief data officer, I think what I really liked about that kind of whole idea of the chief data officer is, I think with the world of governance, it used to be seen as about regulation or compliance, has been why it was in existence. But actually what we're seeing is organizations going, no, this is about driving business value for our organization, whether it be around customer experience or innovation or time to market, whatever it happens to be. But actually this is data governance now contributing to the value of the business. And that's how it's helping drive success through digital transformation. Just a few stats, but you can see rapid increase in the number of chief data officers, and clearly we're seeing those as being strategically important, how organizations are reviewing all of data. Don't just take our word for it. This idea of data democratization, data for people by people, it drives value in lots of different ways. So organizations can tap into this and can show value in lots of different parts of the business in ways which are relevant for them, which is great. But we've got challenges for all of this. And I'm just going to give you some examples of a few of them, but you've talked a lot, particularly in the previous webinar, about data strategy. Not everyone's got one, and they're not always finished or adopted. We've got data literacy issues, data trust issues, we've got data privacy issues, and of course we've got data growth issues. So this messy world that we talk about, it's hard. We absolutely get that, and that's why I think you need to have structure, and we need to have a good, clear plan and understanding of what it is you're trying to do that's driven from your data strategy. But actually governance supports the data strategy. It's not a data strategy. Quite a fundamental point, but it also supports data literacy, trust, privacy, and of course, growth. And I guess in terms of some of the key things I just wanted to finish with is this idea of what we call data democratization, which is about the opportunity for getting everybody engaged in data, because if we're going to live in this new world, then everybody does need to be engaged. And we talked a little bit about this, but this is about data context. And I think it's really important that organizations start to get that in data context. I think governance gives them that, or helps give them that. Getting the right model to deliver that, I think, is really important. But actually, it's how they're going to drive the value out of their data-driven digital transformation. So we've gone through a lot quite quickly there, Mel, and I'm just conscious of, we've got some questions which have come in. So I think we'll stop with the slides now. Maybe we can just cover one or two questions.
Yep, absolutely. Yep.
That's cool. So one of the things I just wanted to quickly to talk to you was actually with this, the idea of your data governance organizational model. So one of the questions we had was, how important is it to get the data governance organizational model right?
Yeah, that's always a tricky one to balance, I think. To be honest with you, you can't think about this as a sort of 5-10-year program.
No.
You've got to start out by thinking about who's got the right mix of skills and where do they sit within the organisation. A lot of people will be undertaking a lot of data management activity, data governance activity already.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about really capitalising on that, ensuring it's got some structure behind it, and also some prioritisation and vision.
Yep.
Underneath that, you're going to have to think about, like we all do with our skill sets across the organisation, which is what is the succession plan and what are we doing for the future, and then thinking about how do we have that trade-off between getting those skills more embedded within the business so that we can then start incorporating that business value and that business model review, but along with some of those data skill sets as well.
Yep.
So that data governance is then more proliferated, and those traditional forces that would use data first and think about governance second.
Mm-hmm.
And I think getting that balance right is where we need to sit, because clearly in the future we're going to have a lot of changes with technology. Things are going to be done faster, smarter.
Yeah.
The need for human intervention is going to be reduced quite dramatically. So where does the value add go when we come up against some errors or questions or things that need remediation? I think they'll sit more in the business world rather than in the typical IT technology world. But that's not to say that you clearly need technical skill sets to be able to handle platform build as opposed to just on-point solutions that we're typically used to.
And keep flexible, I guess. So I think it's probably a key point.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. A couple of the questions before we go. I thought this was kind of an interesting one here. How can we get senior buy-in for data governance but struggling to get senior level engagement? That's a really good question.
Yeah, so I'm just going by personal experience on this one. But for me, it's around really being able to articulate what the business pain is, showing real value and real examples of what that is, and then being able to apply direct monetization to that. There'll always be indirect monetization around efficiency, effectivity, that kind of thing. But what is the actual impact of risk, reputation, value add to the business, or indeed the ability to do, product development, innovation as a result of poor, bad quality data. So I would start off with doing some data profiling. So that's you're able to then have real examples of where this data is either mismatched or badly managed, and therefore you can put a quantitative and a qualitative stamp on what actually does that mean. So that will help you develop a business case. It'll help you develop executive summaries for the people that should really be concerned with this, and being able to socialise it in a business language, not a technical one, that people actually understand and how they can demonstrate it's got a direct impact on them. So I think that's got a big piece on that data management culture and socialisation within the business. I think that's very, very important.
And I liked a really good, nice, tangible example of something that somebody can physically go and do to help kind of address that one. One last question before we have time to wrap up.
Yeah, so this is one that's just come in for you, Andy. So you were talking just there about data governance and data democratization, but how do you really get the balance right, given that they're quite opposite extremes?
Yeah, I think there's a perception that they are opposites. I think actually we have to find that kind of happy ground in between those two. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. So in the world of data governance, it's not about locking everything down. It's about doing the right things in the right place at the right time. But of course, in the world that we want of digital transformation with agility and data-driving process, that we need the freedom to make the decisions. So actually what we've got to find is we've got to find the happy ground in between those two. And actually then data governance becomes a capability that supports agility, and it supports change, and it supports what the business is trying to do at the pace it's trying to do it, but doing it through a value-added way. And when we do have to put some barriers away, we're doing it for a very clearly understood reason. And sometimes it might be very simple things that the business might not necessarily recognize. So if they wanted to do something with data, and suddenly there's a GDPR policy says, well, actually, you can't do that. Actually, let's tell the business, actually, the policy says you can't do that. Let's tell them before they do it, not afterwards. So if we can start to use this in a proactive way, then when we do have to put some constraints around, and clearly sometimes there will have to be some, then people understand why they're there. And if we do that in a timely manner, then people will be more collaborative in terms of what the alternatives will be. So I think it's a really important point about finding the happy medium between the two. It's going to ebb and flow as well, which again, coming back to your point about flexibility, I think it's really important in terms of the way that governance is going to be successful, that we remain flexible in how we do it.
Okay, thanks, Andy.
No, thank you. And we've run out of time. So thank you very much for those of you attending. Mel, thank you very much for your contribution again. Excellent, again, as usual. We'll be sharing the recording from this with everybody through the usual channels. So you'll be able to get access to all of the materials, etc. afterwards as well. What we'll also be doing is, if you have any questions, then obviously you can get in touch with us. As we said, this is the second in a whole series. We've got 4 webinars and roundtables planned. We've got a couple of roundtables coming up. We've got one in London and one in Glasgow in a few weeks' time. So if you have a look on places like LinkedIn or the usual social channels, you find all the details if you want to come and register and hear more about some of the topics that we've been talking about today. I'd just like to say thanks very much for your time. Hope you found it useful, and if there's anything else we can do, please reach out and get in touch with us.
Thank you.